Bellefontaine City Council is now in session. Please rise for the invocation led by Councilman Reed, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
We gather here today seeking your guidance, wisdom, and strength as we come together to serve this community. We ask that you bless the members of our city council and all who work to make our city a better place. Help us to approach each decision with compassion, integrity, and a spirit of unity, so that we may serve in a way that honors the values, justice, and kindness, and respect for all. As we meet the day after Veterans Day, we pause to honor the men and women who have served our nation in the armed forces. We're grateful for their courage, dedication, and sacrifice. Bless them, Lord, for their willingness to defend our freedoms and to protect our way of life. May they know our deep gratitude, and may they find peace, health, and hope in the years to come. May your presence guide our deliberations today, and may all that we do here be in service to the common good. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Just a couple notes to some members of the audience. It is a council rule, no hats on in council chambers. Thank you. All right. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Springs?
Here.
Mr. Ayler?
Here.
Mrs. Baker?
Here.
Mr. Davis?
Here.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Here.
Mrs. James? Here. Mr. Reese?
Here.
Mr. Springs.
I make a motion that we suspend the reading of the minutes.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reese?
Yes.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Christopher.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council. Tonight, I have a new fire chief to swear in and 2 new firefighters to swear in. I'd like to do tonight. Brian Wilson. This is Brian Wilson, Captain Wilson. A little bit more. You can come over this way a little bit. You raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Brian Wilson,
I, Brian Wilson,
pledge my solemn oath.
pledge my solemn oath
I will support the Constitution of the United States,
I will support the Constitution of the United States,
the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
laws of the State of Ohio,
the laws of the State of Ohio,
and ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
and ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
I pledge and affirm
I pledge and affirm
that I will perform my assigned duties
that I will perform my assigned duties
in a manner deemed proper and professional
in a manner deemed proper and professional
as the Chief of the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
as the Chief of the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
I will uphold and enforce
I will uphold and enforce
the law and statutes
the law and statutes
according to the authority,
according to the authority,
responsibility, and discretion
responsibility, and discretion
vested in me by my commission
vested in me by my commission
and job classification.
and job classification.
I will abide by the rules and regulations,
I will abide by the rules and regulations,
policies and procedures
policies, and procedures
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
My position as fire chief
My position as fire chief
is that of public service,
is that of public service,
and I will personally extend every effort
and I will personally extend every effort
to fulfill my assigned duties
to fulfill my assigned duties
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my ability.
I will not exceed or misuse
I will not exceed or misuse
my authority or job description
my authority or job description
as fire chief
as fire chief
for unauthorized or unethical personal gain.
for unauthorized or unethical personal gain.
I pledge my personal conduct
I pledge my personal conduct
at all times
at all times
to be such as not to reflect
to be such as not to reflect
adversely or unfavorably
adversely or unfavorably
upon myself and the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
upon myself or the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
To these statements,
To these statements,
I voluntarily pledge myself
I voluntarily pledge myself
without reservations
without reservations
as I accept my commission
as I accept my commission
of Fire Chief of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
of Fire Chief of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
Congratulations. This is the next fire chief for the Bellefontaine Fire Department. I began my service when he hired in at the fire department, so I've watched him grow up. That's a pleasure of mine to bring him on board.
See if I can do this without poking myself. And without my glasses on.
There you go.
Dave, you should.
You got family here tonight?
Yeah, I promised I wouldn't do this, but my wife can stand up. Or wait, raise your hand, whatever. So my wife Stacy, I got my daughter Hannah, my parents John and Brenda, my son Gavin, his friend from college Kimberly, my in-laws Tim and Pam Palmer, and lifelong family friends Alan Karen Blank. And I'm not gonna go through them everybody, but I got
There's a lot of firefighters.
a lot of church friends, yeah, my pastor Rick and some other church. Oh, yeah, and there's my sister, she's separated, so my sister Renee.
Same.
And of course, everybody knows Carmen Lisa.
But he signed these first and then, you're not official yet, I guess. Is there anything else you'd like to do now?
Thank you. I don't have anything else to say other than,
Is there a couple more guys here?
well, yeah, we do have that. So as, I guess as my first duty as a fire chief, we do have 2 new firefighters to swear in. I'm gonna go in alphabetical order, just to be fair. So first up will be Slade Wilcoxon. I'm sorry, I'm alphabetical order. Matthew McMillan.
You didn't go to school around here. Matthew, raise your right hand, repeat after me. I, Matthew McMillan,
I, Matthew McMillan,
pledge my solemn oath,
pledge my solemn oath.
I will support the Constitution of the United States
I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Ohio
and the Constitution of the State of Ohio
and the laws of the State of Ohio
and the laws of the State of Ohio
and the ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
and the ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
I pledge and affirm
I pledge and affirm
that I will perform my assigned duties
that I will perform my assigned duties
in a manner deemed proper and professional
in a manner deemed proper and professional
as a firefighter paramedic
as a firefighter paramedic
for the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
for the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
I will uphold and enforce
I will uphold and enforce
the law and statutes
the law and statutes
according to the authority,
according to the authority,
responsibility, and discretion
responsibility, and discretion
vested in me by my commission
vested in me by my commission
and job classification.
and job classification.
I will abide by the rules and regulations,
I will abide by the rules and regulations,
policies, and procedures
policies, and procedures
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
My position as a firefighter
My position as a firefighter
is that of public service,
is that of public service,
and I will personally extend every effort
and I will personally extend every effort
to fulfill my assigned duties
to fulfill my assigned duties
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my ability.
I will not exceed or misuse
I will not exceed or misuse
my authority or job description
my authority or job description
as a firefighter paramedic
as a firefighter paramedic
for unauthorized or unethical gain.
for unauthorized or unethical gain.
I pledge my personal conduct
I pledge my personal conduct
at all times
at all times
to be such as not to reflect
to be such as not to reflect
adversely or unfavorably
adversely or unfavorably
upon myself and the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
upon myself or the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
To these statements,
To these statements,
I voluntarily pledge myself
I voluntarily pledge myself
without reservation
without reservation
as I accept my commission
as I accept my commission
as firefighter paramedic
as firefighter paramedic
of the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
of the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We can do the pin it on, and we'll at least, if you don't want to put it on your suit, we can at least get a picture of us.
Here you go.
shaking
How about
hands.
that?
You did too. That'll work.
All right, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
All good. Any more?
Okay, Matthew.
Matt, I'm going to sign your commission. Congratulations.
I guess you're next.
Now, Slade Wilcox. How you doing?
ready for this? Raise your right hand. I, Slade Wilcoxon,
I, Slade Wilcoxon,
pledge my solemn oath
pledge my solemn oath.
I will support the Constitution of the United States
I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
laws of the State of Ohio,
laws of the State of Ohio,
and ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
and ordinances of the City of Bellefontaine.
I pledge and affirm
I pledge and affirm
that I will perform my assigned duties
that I will perform my assigned duties
in a manner deemed proper and professional
in a manner deemed proper and professional
as a firefighter paramedic
as a firefighter paramedic
for the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
for the City of Bellefontaine Fire Department.
I will uphold and enforce
I will uphold and enforce
the law and statutes
the law and statutes
according to the authority,
according to the authority,
responsibility, and discretion
responsibility, and discretion
vested in me by my commission.
vested by me in my commission
And job classification.
and job classification.
I will abide by the rules, regulations,
I will abide by the rules, regulations,
policies, and procedures
policies, and procedures
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
set forth by the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
My position as a firefighter
My position as a firefighter
is that of public service,
is that of public service,
and I will personally extend every effort
and I will personally extend every effort
to fulfill my assigned duties
to perform my assigned duties
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my ability.
I will not exceed or misuse
I will not exceed or misuse
my authority or job description
my authority or job description
as firefighter paramedic
as firefighter paramedic
for unauthorized or unethical gain.
for unauthorized or unethical gain.
I pledge my personal conduct
I pledge my personal conduct
at all times
at all times
to be such as not to reflect
to be such as not to reflect
adversely or unfavorably
adversely or unfavorably
upon myself and the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
upon myself and the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
To these statements,
To these statements,
I voluntarily pledge myself
I voluntarily pledge myself
without reservations
without reservations
as I accept my commission
as I accept my commission
as firefighter paramedic
as firefighter paramedic
of the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
of the Bellefontaine Fire Department.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. Gene, I think we have to introduce our guests. And one of those will be for you. Keep one of you. Take one. Congrats.
Thank you. Congratulations once again.
Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Yeah, I did. I forgot to have these gentlemen introduce their family. If you want to, Slade, you can go ahead, and then we can let Matthew.
That's my wife, Maria, and then my father, Lee, my Uncle Sean, my Uncle Josh, my Grandma Donna, my brother-in-law, Garrett, my sister, Morgan, my Aunt Jennifer, and then my good time, long-time friend, Lacey. So that is my family and friends.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
You betcha.
Matt,
I've got my dad, mom, Bill, David, Bill, and some coworkers here. We're gonna say it's
Best mustache.
Yeah. So, are you done with me?
we're
Or-
done.
Okay. I just want to let everyone who was here for the swearing in, we do have some cake and some coffee down in the fire department, so feel free to go down there and we'll get to know these guys a lot better, and I'll be down in just a short minute.
Alternatively, you're all welcome to stay to see the wheels of government work for you, but coffee and refreshments and cake sound much better.
I still have a report to give, so I'm gonna hang out here for a little bit. And I do want to invite, any admin or city council members down as well, so.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll let these people shuffle out here.
All right.
No.
Shows how you do great.
Yeah. Oh, it's coffee.
That's right.
Thanks, Ben.
They wouldn't let me.
Okay, I think that concluded the mayor's report. We'll now move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Dodd.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council. Good evening, guests that remain here with us tonight. Thanks for being here. I just want to give you a kind of an update. As promised, you've got a lengthy legislative agenda in front of you tonight. A lot of it deals with our end of the year ordinances that are setting us up for next year. A big part of that, our compensation packages for our staff. You've got ordinances for supervisory, clerical, service, the municipal court, as well as police and fire collective bargaining agreements on the agenda. Just a heads up, we are going to ask you to table the fire department, the collective bargaining agreement this evening. We had some last minute changes with their negotiating team this morning. We just want to make sure we've had ample time to review it before we take official action on it. So we will ask to table that this evening and bring it back at our next meeting. Just want to give you a little insight into the wage requests that we've made. It is significantly higher than in years past. What we did in this first year of the police and fire contracts, as well as the rest of our staff, has took a good hard look at all of our positions on a case-by-case basis to see where we needed to make some adjustments to be more competitive so that we can continue to attract and retain quality employees. So the increases are not going to be the same across the board for every position. And they really run a wide range, I believe anywhere from 3% on up, with an average increase of about 10% across the city, across all our departments. I know that sounds like a big number, but we've made a lot of investment over the last couple of years in our capital as far as equipment and infrastructure. And the mayor and I really feel that it's time we got to make that investment in our staff as well, because without our staff and good people to do the work for the city, none of that other investment matters. So we think this is the year that we need to do that. So we're looking at 2025 as a reset year for wages, if you can think of it that way. And then in 26 and 27, we would anticipate coming back with more of an across the board increase. It's more uniform for the staff, regardless of position. But again, we kind of looked at this on a position by position basis to get a little closer to be competitive with the market that's around us. So I just wanted to give you some insight into that, but that's really what we spent the majority of our time on over the last really 6 weeks, is really hammering out these agreements with the two unions, and then coming up with a compensation package that we think is fair and doable for us on the administrative side, but also makes us competitive with surrounding communities and within our own. So appreciate your consideration of that this evening. And if you've got any further questions about it, I'd be happy to answer those for you. With that on my report.
Thank you. Mr. Dodds, any questions or comments from Mr. Dodds? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stiles.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, council and guests. My role, of course, is to draft the legislation, a lot of which is routine from a technical standpoint. So I do want to thank Wes and the administration, the mayor, finance committee for considering these requests. I am in favor of it. I agree that our best asset is our people. And so I think this is in line to get our pay where it needs to be. So I am in favor of that. As it relates to the Bellefontaine Municipal Court, we have kind of created a new pay scale rather than approving legislation for each of the various departments and positions. It now is on a scale, so the prosecutor's on there, the one-person prosecutor staff is on there, but also clerks and everybody. So it frees up our agenda ultimately in the future. We can see the numbers and we can work on it as one unit as opposed to having 8 or 9 different pieces of legislation, modifying those. So again, that was an idea really of Wes's, so I want to give him credit for that, but it's definitely a good move going forward. Keeps our eyes in one spot there too. So that's all I have for this evening. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Any questions or comments from Mr. Stolle? Seeing none, we'll move to Auditor, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one thing to report on. Last Thursday, we had a presentation, virtual presentation to Moody Credit Services, which they will set our bond rating for the bonds that you authorized a couple meetings ago to be issued. Part of that meeting was Mr. Volrath, Mr. Mark Fissel, who's our city treasurer, Mark Kamer, who's with Densmore and Scholl Legal Services, who does the legal for our bonding, and then Mike Burns, who is with R.W. Baird, who does the actual bond presentation or issuance. The presentation went very well. It was 41 PowerPoint slides over an hour and a half, and each of us had different things that we presented, basically presenting the city, where it's going, where we are financially, and projections on that. Mr. Burns kind of headed it up. He is hoping that we get a AA3 bond rating, which is the highest. He goes everything he's been involved with. We should, with all the information. But we'll wait and see. I did get an email this afternoon from Mr. Kamer that they have not issued our rating yet. But once they do get that rating out, the bonds will be going out for sale. If you're interested in buying any, contact a financial planner or investor here in town, whatever. I'm sure Mr. Volrath might elaborate more on that. So it went well. Another part of the financing of the parks, it's in the bond issue. We're going to, or as you approved, the additional state income tax that the citizens did, instead of waiting till we received enough of that money, which to start any of these major projects, the bond issue will allow us to start them within maybe the next year or even this summer, see some ground being broke for some of the major projects. So that ends my report unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Any comments or questions from Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, we'll move to Fire Chief, Chief Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, administration and council. First off, just again, thank you for allowing us to hijack your meeting for a few minutes. Obviously, we have the 2 new firefighters that we just sworn in. Those were 2 of 4 that we have put job offers out to. So the other 2 are conditional. They still have to get through their pension physicals and background checks yet. One of them did reach out to me, and he took a full-time job at another department, so we kind of missed him. So we will be reaching further down the list to make a conditional offer to him yet. Also, I don't have my notes with me. I'm trying to remember. So we are in the process of promoting our new assistant chiefs. So we have 5 firefighters who are in that process right now. The written test is complete, so we have an assessment center they have to go through, and then panel interviews will be the next step beyond that. So I don't know that we have an actual date yet as to when that's going to take place, but hopefully we'll have some new fire officers in place here pretty quick. And then we can start moving forward with what we need to do downstairs. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions or comments for the Chief? Thank you for your report.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna
Congratulations.
head on downstairs. Thank you again. Thanks, guys.
Engineer, Mr. Bischoff.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few things. First of all, on our project, so we completed the resurfacing of the wastewater plant last week. That went pretty well. Our street resurfacing program is complete. They were working on some punch list items. There's still a couple small things to do. We finished Blue Jacket walking trail. They did come back in and do some minor repairs on that. Just it was a soft spot at the north end and a couple of rough spots that they've sealed. So that should be good to go now. Development wise, you'll see that the Bigby Coffee, the structure's up. They're working on the sidewalk now. I've been told Huey Magoo's, which was there in front of Kroger, probably 3 or 4 weeks they anticipate being ready to open there. You can see the work at TJ Maxx there as well. They've got the front of that building tore off. They're starting to submit for the side permit, things like that, so that seems to be going pretty quickly. We're still seeing a lot of interest in the residential market. More and more land seems to be popping up for discussions as far as single family, mainly single family homes. So we're seeing some things move. We've had conversations with Horton out at Leadville Ridge. They're getting ready to start submitting their zoning applications as well. So those homes will start taking shape here in the next couple of months. We're looking at, or we're participating in trying to find a funding source to pave part of Simon Kenton Trail, the part that's chip and sealed. We've had some. We had a Zoom call with ODOT last week about a special solicitation for funding they have. It is a kind of a revolving application process every quarterly. I'm not sure we'll get anything in this quarter. There's going to be some challenges with ODOT as far as how that path lies within an easement. Some areas it goes out, which could trigger ODOT's lengthy process of right-of-way and environmental. And they're starting to work on the scope of a feasibility study for the extension, for looking at the extension up to Indian Lake. So those are things ongoing. One public service announcement. We're getting close, hopefully, to the end of leaf season, but please remind people not to rake them into the street, rake them to the curb, just don't rake them into the street. Especially with the rain we had, it causes havoc with the storm sewers. We'll see street flooding, not to mention just a hazard for drivers as well. So that is my report. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bischoff. Any questions from Mr. Bischoff? Thank you, sir.
I got one more thing. Sorry, I forgot.
You closed your case. No more evidence can be presented.
The cooperative sidewalk program, you guys authorized that spec bid. We open bids next Friday on that, just to let people know.
Thank you, Mr. Bischoff.
You're welcome.
Economic Development, Mr. Ballrath.
Thank you, Mr. President, Union Council Administration. Just want to echo Mr. Bretlander's comments on bond rating presentation. This really was kind of a cool culmination of progress that the city's been having. It was very clear this is not just about financial stability, it's about the community and its strength. And so they seem to be very interested in downtown redevelopment and the fact that we have 500 houses in the pipeline and all of these things that have come together from TRC's growth and Honda's growth and continued investment for area businesses. If it weren't for all of these pieces coming into place, I don't know that we'd be in a position to be talking about that kind of a rating. Whether we get that or not, all those things that you have been working on are incredibly meaningful. So thank you. It's one of these kind of projects that pulls it together like, oh my goodness, there's a lot that's been accomplished and it's teeing us up for good things to come. So thank you for all that. I really appreciate your leadership there. Next, just one really simple thing. We have Christmas season upon us, and it's a time of year where everyone's clicking on Amazon to buy all their gifts. And I want to tell you, we challenge you to buy one thing locally this year, at least one thing. So if you all want to be some of the first, we have this campaign. You go to the grocery store and like, hey, do you want to, donate $1 and you get your name on a balloon, you put it up on the window. Well, we're doing I supported local in Logan County. So these will be at our local retailers. You make a purchase, you can sign your name, we'll pick them up, we'll put them up in the chamber office. If you'd like to, you can take one. You can go make your purchase, drop it off, or just stop by and we'll get it up for you. I really would love to see everyone in our community make at least one local purchase this year for Christmas gifts. So keep that in mind. That's part of the narrative and how we keep growing and getting better. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ballrath. Any questions or comments from Mr. Ballrath? Thank you for bringing those. Thank you, sir. Next is Downtown Development Director, Maddie Stotler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, all. Well, I'm going to start right into the holiday season. First of all, I want to say thank you to the city and the Christmas ladies. They, I know, have put way more work than just today setting up and getting everything out. We had the privilege to help this year, and I'm really glad we did. They do so much throughout the year, so we just want to say thank you because I know it's a whole effort, it's collaborative, and so it's very nice to see, just how beautiful Bellefontaine going to be for this holiday season. So with that, I will briefly chat through some of the big things the DBP will be participating in. We are having a Santa shed. This will be located on the courthouse by the fountain. We've talked with West with this, and this will be being delivered next week on November 20th, and then pickup time will probably be the beginning of January due to obviously the holidays. So that will be happening every weekend. This will be a free thing for kids to come down, take pictures with Santa. Obviously, there's certain hours for that, so that will be all posted. And then the city commissioners has approved for us to put a Christmas tree of lights per se, where the very small Christmas tree currently is. So that will be getting up next week as well. And obviously we'll have the grand lighting of that during the Christmas parade. So then that leads me into the Christmas parade happening on Friday, December 6th. Just an important announcement on road closures. They'll probably be closed between 1 and 2, as we'll have pre-holiday activities happening before the Christmas parade. This is to ensure that we get all the cars out of the way. We've had safety concerns of children popping out during the parade, so we're just kind of trying to keep everything safely as possible. We'll also have volunteers walking with the parade, just trying to keep everyone safe so we can all enjoy this season. And then the streets that will be closed during that time will be South Main, East and West Columbus, and then we'll only close East and West Chillicothe just for the parade, as last year we had a lot of traffic watching from there. So the only other road closure we will have during the holiday season is during our events on December 13th or 15th for having carriage rides. Just the route is a very small route, so we're just closing the small side of South Opera, like right by Sweet Aromas, starting at I should know, but at least the corner of the courthouse, I guess, would be the best. So that will just be only closed during the times of the events that we're having. So there's something happening every weekend, so we invite everyone to come down, lots of free things, lots of ways to celebrate, and again, give back to the local community.
Is that all?
That's all I have, yes.
Okay, very good. I don't want to cut you off. Any questions or comments from Ms. Stotler? Seeing none, thank you, ma'am. That will conclude our reports from administration. We'll now move to reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, you have your water.
I think I'm going to be
Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We do have quite a few ordinances on for this evening. Some of them I'll try to keep it as quick as we can. The first one is 2486, which is the temporary appropriation for current expenses for fiscal year 25. And the general fund total is $12,897,095. And the total of all funds is $30,388,787. We'll be asking for first reading only on that one. Then we have 2487. This is an ordinance that we do every year that just authorizes purchases for miscellaneous supplies, equipment, and services for 2025. And we're asking for first reading only on that ordinance as well. 2488 is compensation for the municipal court judge for 2025. This is established the amount of the municipal court judge salary is set by revised code, and that is shared. State pays part of that, and the city and the county as well pays that salary. We're asking for first reading only on that one as well. 2489 is a supplemental appropriations for court, cemetery, parks, and Myra. Those total $15,500. These are just basically some cost overruns here toward the end of the year to finish out the year. That one we're asking for first and final, and so we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule on that one. 2490 is also supplemental. This is for the ARPA retention bonuses because for parks, because they were not listed in the previous ordinance that we had on the agenda. So this one we're asking for first and final as well. Also waive the 3 reading rule. The 2491 is compensation for president of council, council members, clerk of council, the mayor, the law director, the auditor, and the treasurer for 2025. These salaries are the same as they were for 2024, but we have to do an ordinance, so that would be first reading only as well. 2492 is compensation for the department supervisors. And as Mr. Dodds explained, there's a variety of, but this is kind of a reset year. So we're asking for first reading only on all of the pay ordinances. 2493 is for the service workers' pay. 2494 is for the clerical workers. And 2495 is for the municipal court employees. And I just wanted to make a note that I appreciate the work that they've done on to revamp a little bit how we are doing the, instead of a specific salary, we have ranges so that we can look at individuals when we're setting pay scales. And then resolution, I guess we didn't talk about this one. It allows the county auditor to remove a tax lien on a property, and that will be asking for adoption on that one. 2497, that's the one that Mr. Dodds mentioned as well, that we are going to ask that to be tabled until the meeting on 11/26. 2498 is the collective bargaining agreement for the Ohio Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, the police and safety services for 2025 through 2027. We're asking for first reading only on that one. And let's see, for second reading this evening, we have 2480. Yes. That's the contract for the fire station alerting system, second reading only on that one. 2481 is a supplemental for the ARPA retention bonuses, and we're going to be asking for second and final on that one. So we'll also ask to waive the 3 reading rule. 2482 is supplemental appropriations for parks, and that one we're asking for second and final as well to waive the 3 reading rule too on that one. And 2484 is the master services agreement for the Bellefontaine Regional Airport. That's a second reading only. And then we have one ordinance for adoption this evening, and that is the ordinance establishing the compensation for council president, council members, clerk of council, the mayor, the law director, the auditor, and the treasurer, and this would be for 2026. We'll ask for adoption on that this evening. That ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Mr. Dodge?
Just to clarify, the resolution that is asking for county auditor to remove assessed costs, that is for a property maintenance assessment that was made and then subsequently paid to us after it was submitted to the county auditor. So that's just cleaning that up for that property owner.
Thank you for clarifying, Mr. Dodds. Rules Committee, Mrs. James?
Thank you, Mr. President. We have one ordinance for first reading only. That's the solar zoning legislation that's been updated with language about bond requirements, revisiting the bond requirement every 5 years, and is still requiring conditional use permit from BZA. We also have an ordinance for second reading only, and that is regarding enforcement of code violations, basically changing the language such that the prosecutor is able to prosecute when needed. And that ends my report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Bonnie, just a note on the minutes, 2499 identifies as a rule, as a safety committee. So just want to make sure we got it reported. Safety committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Utilities committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Utilities Committee met last Friday, November 8th, from 3:30 until 5:40, because I am long-winded. But we talked about several things. The trash contract will be up for renew in 26, so next year we'll need to start working on that. We also, Mr. Bischoff and Mrs. Stratton had pointed out some different ordinances and some language that needs to be cleaned up, so we'll be sending that to the law director. We discussed current rates and possibly in 25 looking at our base rates to see if they need any adjustment. We also talked about changing some wording, tap fees, if we should call them now capacity fees, and setting new rates for them. So we just went over some cleanup items that may be on the agenda before the end of this year or may not make it to legislation until the beginning of next. So that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. I got one item I just would like to refer to you for your committee's consideration in 2025, and maybe Wes can comment on that just for future purposes. We don't need to address it tonight, but it's the lighting that runs down Ludlow, and then also on Lake around Blue Jacket Park there in the mornings. It's pretty dark. And I don't know, and I was driving down that the other day and just kind of didn't notice a whole lot of street lights. And I know we don't put in the street lights, and I know we have a contract to do that and for them to maintain that, but just something for consideration around that corner, because we've got 3 schools there, and kids walking in right now, in the mornings when they're walking to school, it's dark. So just something to consider for safety purposes. Streets Committee, Mr. Ayler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Member report.
Thank you, Mr. Ayler. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Audit Committee, Mrs. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's the moment we've all been waiting for.
Yes.
The audit has been released last Thursday. Everybody on council and administration should have gotten an email, and the audit is also posted on the website. So I know you were all biting your fingernails, waiting for the audit report. So things are all good, and if you have any questions, I'm sure Fred would like to help you weed through all of that financial language. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fitzpatrick. That concludes the reports of standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. If there are any citizens in the audience who wish to address council, please approach the lectern, state your name and address, after which the chair will recognize you to speak for up to 5 minutes. Seeing no one approach the lectern, that will conclude our communications from citizens portion of our meeting. I will now move to our legislative agenda with ordinances and resolutions for first reading.
An ordinance making temporary appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures during the fiscal year beginning January 1st, 2025 and ending December 31st, 2025, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the purchase of miscellaneous supplies, equipment, and services for use in 2025 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
I need to abstain because it affects the family member's business.
Abstention is noted and accepted.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation of the Bellefontaine Municipal Court Judge for 2025 and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick? Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of court, cemetery, parks, and Maira, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first and final.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of ARPA retention bonuses for parks and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first and final.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the president of council, council members, clerk of council, mayor, law director, and auditor for 2025 and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency, 2025 supervisory wage ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency. Did I do the wage? I did the wage.
Yes, we just did wage.
Service workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency, 2025 clerical workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain Bellefontaine Municipal Court employees and declaring an emergency, 2025 Bellefontaine Municipal Court wage ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
A resolution authorizing the city of Bellefontaine to order the Logan County Auditor to remove an additional tax lien on certain real estate taxes as stated herein.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance approving a new collective bargaining agreement between the International Association of Firefighters and the City of Bellefontaine for fire safety services commencing January 1st, 2025, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
I'd like to make a motion that we table this ordinance till the meeting of 11/26.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker, just at the next meeting, you would need to make a motion to remove that from the table. Okay.
So I will just put that on the agenda as first reading, all right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, and it'll have a new number.
Oh, a new number, yes. Yeah, yes, it would. An ordinance approving a new collective bargaining agreement between the Ohio Patrolmen's Benevolent Association and the City of Bellefontaine for police safety services commencing January 1st, 2025, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance approving and adopting new planning and zoning regulations regarding solar energy systems for the City of Bellefontaine to be codified as Chapter 1166 of the codified ordinances of said city.
Mr. James.
Move to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Davis.
Mr. Springs,
No.
Mr. Ayler,
No.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
No.
and Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances and resolutions for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract with Motorola Solutions Incorporated for fire station alerting system and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of ARPA retention bonuses and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of Park Department and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the three reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler, or Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Ms. Baker.
Motion to pass on second and final.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mr. Ayler,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to enter into contract with Chaw Consulting Incorporated for professional services related to the Bellefontaine Regional Airport and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on second reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
I need to abstain because it affects the family member's business.
Abstention noted and accepted.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
An ordinance amending Chapter 1127 enforcement and violations of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. James.
Motion to pass on second reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the president of council, council members, clerk of council, mayor, law director, auditor, and treasurer for 2026 and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Ayler.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mr. Ayler?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Davis?
No.
Mrs. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Well, that concludes our ordinances for third reading and our legislative agenda this evening. Are there any communications from the clerk?
None for me, thank you.
Thank you for doing all that reading. Are there any communications from members of council? Mr. Reeser.
I'd like to express my gratitude to the Parks Department for helping to set up the Field of Honor out at Blue Jacket. It's been a really nice site to go by regularly, and I know the schools are a part of getting names together and everything like that, but I appreciate doing that.
Very much so. I saw them setting it up the other day too, so thank you for that. Any other comments from members of council? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn. Motion made by Mr. Springs, seconded by Mrs. James.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Big John going to Chicago this weekend. I talked to him.